Welcome to Tuesday's Tips from Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura. And helping hands are always helpful in the sewing room. And we can make helping hands out of little scraps of fabric. And they're called enders and leaders. Enders and leaders are little scraps of fabric. And these scraps of fabric can save us time and a lot of headaches. So I have just some scrapped leftover fabric in a little bowl, and I keep it right at the side of my machine. And I can pick up that scrap of fabric and start sewing on it. The first piece, of course, is going to be the leader. The fun part about using these, there are no seam allowances. We can sew anywhere on these scraps of fabric. Put the foot down, hold your threads, and start sewing. This is going to be the last time you will need to hold those threads to keep them out of the way. And will be the last time we will need to trim them out of the way. We can just start sewing. And it doesn't matter where we sew. We can twist this and sew wherever we want. This is just scrap. Starting on this scrap piece of fabric means we don't hold the thread, we don't need to trim anymore, we know the stitches are stitching correctly, and it helps prevent that thread from being pulled underneath. So I'm going to be able to match up my fabrics, and I do want to sew right along this line, but it won't matter where I come off of this piece of fabric. I'm just going to stitch off that fabric about 2 stitches. Leave the needle down and then just have this thread slide right up and touch that needle. I can line up my fabric wherever I need it. If I need a 5/8 seam allowance, a very large seam allowance, a very small one, or the 1/4 inch. I just need to put that fabric where it needs to go. I'm not going to stitch on this because I've already come off of it, but I will be able to stitch on the new seam and start sewing. So this automatically comes out of the way. And stitch. When you come to the end of the seam, we need to use an ender. I'm going to use another piece of fabric, stitch a couple of stitches off of my project piece, and stitch. And stop anywhere in this fabric. We can now take this fabric, pivot it, and trim. I'm going to leave this piece on because I ended with it, and I can take off that top piece that I started with. So now I have no large tails, the threads were not pulled in, and I didn't have to hold those threads. This piece now is going to become my beginning piece. So it won't matter where I stitch on this and how many times I stitch on this. I just want to come off a couple of stitches. The needle is down, and regardless if I use pins or not, I could just take that fabric and put it right against that needle and start stitching. When you come off the one edge, stitch a couple of stitches, put that scrap fabric in, and we're ready to go. Pivot that fabric, and now I can trim. So this little scrap of fabric really does save a lot of time. We're not having to hold those threads. We know the stitches are running correctly, and we could just start sewing. So regardless if you're doing a garment where you're going to do a very large seam at the 5/8 seam allowance, quilt squares, or crafts and hobbies, if we always start with that scrap and end with the scrap, we never have to worry about our threads. This little piece takes the worry out of it. So with that little bowl of scrap fabrics that you get to stitch on, it's going to save us from having to hold those threads out of the way, making sure that the machine is stitching, and to make sure that the threads are not being pulled back inside. And these enders and leaders can be done with any project, any fabric, and any application. So this becomes a great helping hand. Thank you for joining me today on Tuesday's Tips. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're talking about next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.